Hey everybody, welcome to Downtime Activities and welcome to the Bonus Action Podcast where Matt and I sit down and have the conversations we have anyway, just with a microphone recording and this slight focus to sort of the course of our discussions. And this time we're going to talk about something that is extremely important in the vast majority of tabletop games. It's something that if done right, adds an incredible amount of depth and incredible amount of complexity to a campaign, and if done wrong, will ruin the entire experience for the game master, the players, really everybody involved. And that's your main villain or villains.
Big bad evil guy.
It's a fairly straightforward topic as well a extremely complicated one as sort of par for the course, I suppose.
Yeah. Like you said, not every, but almost every campaign will have likely multiple villains throughout it, or kind of multiple leaders of evil organizations or evil plots. But there's usually kind of one that's either overarching throughout the campaign or is kind of the late levels of the campaign's big villain. That's kind of the likely will lead to the big climactic fight. Your Vecnas and your ancient red dragons and things like that.
Your Strahd von Zarovich and whatnot.
Exactly. These kind of big evils that are the big final fights a lot of the time. And that's mechanical talk that we could get into later on. But there's a lot of things that can, like you said, go into making this go well and make it go really, really negative. In a broad sense, we'll kind of cut into a couple different ideas of like big topics. In a broad sense, what do you think makes the main villain a good main villain? What kind of stuff do you try and include in a main villain to make it hit right in your campaigns?
I mean, it's really dependent on what you're aiming for, what the style of the campaign is, or like the story you're trying to tell. And that's really going to determine, the type of villain that you want to use, or villains. For example, in the first big D&D campaign that I ran, the idea of a world sort of turning from a low magic Epic 6 world into a high magic 1 through 20 D&D world. And magic is becoming more common, and it's sort of the growth pains of that transition. And the player characters, sort of become magic cops. Sort of become this force trying to, deal with the worst parts of that. Mm-hmm. And I very intentionally wanted the main villain to be sort of a big betrayal. It's sort of a 20th level wizard who's all about sort of that transition in magic power and magic power becoming more common. And his whole sort of philosophy is that if magic is going to become this common, mages need to be the ones in control and need to be in control of magic. And, of course, it's a sort of believable and understandable motivation for a character, but taken to villainous extremes. Mm-hmm. And I wanted that character for there to be this sort of reveal moment where you realize that, this NPC you've been working with the whole time, this almost father figure to one of the characters, is sort of this mysterious master that you've been chasing the whole game. And the big thing that has going for it is that it's remembered. Mm-hmm. It ends up being a fairly memorable moment of, and especially because the reveal was sort of as subtle as it was, and it required sort of player characters putting a couple of pieces together. He, despite the fact that character himself isn't really all that interesting, that's a memorable villain because of that moment and because of that payoff. And really, that's the big thing you're looking for with your villains, is for your players to remember them when the campaigns are over, to remember their names over the course of the campaign, to be, standing there on the rooftop of their burning fortress, screaming their names at the heavens. That's really one of the key hallmarks of a good villain, is that memorability of them. And that's going to hold true no matter what type of villain you build.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good example of the kind of shadowy figure pulling the strings from the background kind of main villain. And I feel like that's a very fun one to do if you're wanting to have that like session 1 to session 100 same main villain throughout.
Right.
Having that kind of shadowy figure pulling the strings is a really good villain for that. Because you can kind of limit the player's access to information on them. Like, certainly they can seek out as much as they can, but until you give them the right leads, they'll probably never be able to locate this individual until it's time for that big kind of climactic encounter to happen. Whereas if you have a much more like the great tyrant on the hill, that's the big evil guy. If that's the big evil guy from the start to the finish and it's a long ongoing campaign, at some point your players might just try and storm the keep. And you might not be ready for that. And you need to be ready for that if you do something along those lines. So having a shadowy figure is kind of helpful in limiting that. You can also make kind of insurmountable odds, but that's never stopped players before.
Right, and you know, it's never stopped them from winning before either.
This is facts.
We could probably just do a whole campaign on players doing impossible things.
Speaking of Strahd mods here, our like level 4 punk asses is jumped him like early on in our little soiree into Ravenloft, took his lunch money and blew a campaign wide open.
Yes.
So you have to be careful with main villains.
But at the same time, it's Strahd once again ends up being an excellent main villain over the course of the campaign because he's memorable. That's part of the reason that Strahd and Vecna and sort of the classic Dungeons and Dragons big villains, or even the big classic Star Wars villains, if you use the Star Wars RPG system. Inquisitors are probably going to be the main villains of some of your campaigns, at least if you're sort of using Edge of the Empire and Force and Destiny, sort of the way they are intended. And those characters should be very memorable. That's just the main villains across the board. Your main villain has to be memorable, and it's the type of villain you make and how specifically you go about that that's going to change sort of what you're trying to do, the sort of the talking points you need to hit, and the stuff you need to be careful of, as you mentioned. So should we talk about sort of different types of villains?
I think that's a great way. So we kind of talked the shadowy figure behind the scenes. There's kind of the tyrant on the hill sort of character, a great evil who has a lot of power and authority and is in a citadel, a fortress, or somewhere, whether the players know exactly where it is or not, as kind of this figure of authority and power. What's other ideas you have?
The other two that come readily to mind for me are the sort of eldritch horror, the thing that is just unknowably evil.
Or extraplanar in its origin. Whether that's unknowably evil, unfathomable, or simply very, very evil, having an evil purpose, but from a full other plane.
So I think your Cthulhu's, your great demon lords and stuff like that are gonna kind of fall into that category, as well as like if you're stepping into stuff like sci-fi, like I think xenomorphs and stuff like that, or there's a bunch of Magic the Gathering factions that you could kind of blend into that as well.
No, that's not all the major villains. Anyway.
And then the other one that gets overlooked a lot, but I think a lot of DMs and a lot of play groups are going to get a ton of mileage out of, is the shadowy reflection of the player characters. The villain that is in the same line of work as the player characters. It's the leader of another adventuring company, or the knight in charge of another faction of mercenaries or something like that. You can absolutely use those as your main villains all through the campaigns, just on a smaller scale, and really drive force that we hate the them that are almost the us sort of mentality. Like it's very easy to have other criminal organizations, other gangs and stuff, vying against the player characters for the same resources, for the same scores, for the same treasures, and use those as your main villains without sort of stepping into this like grand, large scale territory. And those are absolutely going to be extremely memorable and very hateable villains.
Absolutely. I think that those work best. That style of villain works great for a grassroots campaign.
Yes.
A lower power scale, level scale, whatever. Or just as the kind of main villains of earlier story arcs.
Yes, and they work very well for Edge of the Empire campaigns. If you're doing an Edge of the Empire campaign and it's a story of a group of smugglers, or a group of bounty hunters, building essentially the player character's crew, but as the villains, is really going to, and then like that just sort of constant interaction back and forth across the campaign. You can tell your entire stories that way. If you do a pirate campaign, your main villain doesn't have to be, somebody attached to the Spanish Inquisition or the Commodore of the British Navy. It can be another pirate crew, and just foster that rivalry between the characters. It does tend to foster sort of smaller scale campaigns in most ways.
Or like I said, kind of that earlier story arc. And that's another important beat to hit really quickly here, is that you can have 3 or 4 main villains of especially long running campaigns. It's like it's almost like the module like adventures that were still to this day, but a lot more in the past, where it's like, I'm going to run this module from levels 1 to 4, and then from 5 to 6 it's this, and each of those being their kind of own somewhat confined stories taking place in the same world. Each of those can have their own big bad evil guy, and the scale will be determined by the power level of the players in that situation. And that kind of the us that is them makes great early on villains for that. You can take it longer, but it works best for that or for certain settings. Not to give too much away timing wise when this comes out versus when something else comes out, there's a D&D campaign coming up soon on our channel that I'm going to be running that is very much a kind of a campaign that at the beginning, it's a very sandboxy style game, but at the beginning a lot of that kind of the other factions involved there's going to be some of that kind of interplay, and I'm excited to see how that goes with the kind of cast of characters that's going to be involved with that. I think running that well also, when you say almost like the shadowy reflections of the players, almost literally in the sense of like mechanically, I wouldn't go so far as to be like take their character sheet, copy it, put a new name on the top, and make the guy an asshole.
I wouldn't literally mirror their stats, but and that's something that I'm very fond of doing, especially when you have sort of casts of villains, is intentionally mirroring aspects of the player characters. Even to the sense of sometimes when I set up boss fights, I'll set them up in that way. I know that your artificer mage puts all of this prep work into every battle he goes into. He makes spell scroll goodie bags for all of the other characters, and he's all about sort of controlling the battlefield in a very tactical sense, and making the main wizard villain do the same thing. And having sort of the assassin rogue who has, like a goodie bag of spell scrolls to use against the player characters, and he has, an iron golem to mimic, the guy in heavy armor from the party, because that sort of lets the players expect what's going on a little bit, as well as it's a very fun to have occasional like hoisted by our own petard like kind of moments, and those big villainous boss battles are a good place for those.
And as a guy who likes to play tanks, that there's the big guy, don't worry, he's mine moment is awesome every single time. If you have a player who loves the barbarians, the fighters, the paladins, who likes to be the big burly guy who's a frontliner, and you put across from him but an asshole, and he's like, oh, there's the big guy, like, you guys get the mage. You're like, assassin, take out the mage. The big guy's mine. Like, that moment, they'll love it every single time.
Well, and at the end of the day, we want the players to win, right? As game masters, we want the players to defeat the villain. We want them to successfully complete all of their side quests. They may not, but we're rooting for them.
Yes. Believe it or not.
And
at least if your DM's good, they're rooting for you.
Absolutely. If your DM is not on you, like sort of on your side in that way, find a different game master. Like, find a different group to play with.
If you've run Tomb of Annihilation more than once, he's probably a sadist. He or she's probably a sadist, wants your pain.
That moment where, like, player characters love to feel superior to similar characters to themselves. They like being impressed by similar characters as well, especially, like, if they run into a likable NPC who's also a rogue, the rogue's probably going to be like, I fucking love this guy. I want to be just like this guy. But what the rogue also really wants is to run into the rogue who's an asshole and prove himself the better rogue.
Absolutely.
So when you can build your villainous boss fight to sort of shadowy reflections of the player characters and let the player characters prove themselves the superior, that's going to be a very satisfying moment.
Mm-hmm. The other one you brought up as another option, this kind of extraplanar, unknowable, unfathomable, evil from another dimension. Whether that's, I mean, it can be literally from another plane. It can be something, again, related to a campaign coming up, something from very deep underground in a way,
right.
From a world so different than yours. And that kind of villain is nice to have because usually they're pretty intangible in the sense of, like, unless the players can teleport to wherever or find this underground layer, you can kind of control timing of when interactions will happen. And it also allows for a little bit more, a little less relatable evil. Like, you don't have to be relatable evil if you are a Cthulhu-esque monster from a being of chaos, or from a plane of chaos. You don't have to have, like, oh, I bet he had a rough childhood. It's like, no, that's the giant spaghetti monster from the unfathomable plane. It wants to consume. That's all it knows. We have to stop it.
You're not dealing with villains that have philosophies or grand motivations. You're dealing with something that either just is the way it is, and you're sort of in its way, or you're dealing with something that is just legitimate, pure evil, and there
Devils
is no...
and demons are a good example of that in D&D lore.
And even, like, even devils, I think, quite often kind of stray outside of this camp because they're, like, at least in traditional D&D lore, they're extremely lawful evil. You know, they're not necessarily doing anything that they're doing without purpose.
It's purposeful evil, absolutely.
You know, and I think what we're kind of talking about here is very sort of purposeless evil. It is evil to a, like, purity and on a scale that is, like, truly, like, unknowable and alien. And those make excellent villains, but it's not going to be the type of villain where you get this, like, satisfying monologue or this interesting conversation at any point. But especially for new groups of players, especially for the big sort of late game, everyone's, 23rd level, and you're not just saving the plane, but all of the planes, because that's the power scale the campaign has reached. These make excellent villains to pit players against, and and excellent villains to set at a power scale above and beyond sort of anything else that you've worked with.
Something that can contend with a party of high-level characters by itself, often with ads and whatever. There's kind of a lot of freedom or ease in a villain like that because they can be evil for the sake of evil or evil unintelligible. But there's also some pitfalls with that because you can just have that and it can kind of fall flat. And I think the key to that is typically leaning heavily in to the bizarre, into the unknown about that entity. The thing that makes the giant flying spaghetti monster memorable isn't because it consumes and all it does is consume. It's the interactions the players will have with acolytes of it, with what it does to the world, with kind of really leaning into that, like, Cthulhu-esque horror, mind-twisting sort of aspects, and really bring that to the forefront and making that very visceral and visual, and, like, making the characters really feel the impact of that. I think that's what allows for some of that to be much more memorable. Because otherwise, it's kind of just big evil thing that we kill. Right. If you don't really lean into some specific aspects of that unknowableness of it.
Well, and and you kind of just brought up that memorable aspect again. If part of the point of a good villain is for them to be memorable, that is much harder with the sort of unknowable just evil for the sake of evil sort of entity. You have to, as the game master, you have to end up sort of putting a lot more work into making that villain unique, making those encounters memorable, and making the story written sort of around that enemy memorable, sort of in its own way. And quite often, the vast majority of the interaction with this type of villain is going to only come through acolytes, NPCs, lieutenants, generals. It's not going to come from the boss itself. You'll be fighting its cult over the course of the campaign, and then only right at the last session for the final fight will you actually encounter the thing itself. Because if it's just floating in the sky, the whole campaign, it's really going to lose a lot of impact. It's very much the type of villain that you want the reveal and the fight to sort of come all in one.
And when the fight hits, or just before, when the reveal happens, that should be a pretty world-altering and world-shattering event. Like the sky ripping asunder and the tentacles prying through the heavens and pulling itself into the plane. Like, that should be a really, oh shit moment for the players. That's where you can get some of that memorability and that punch that you lack with the relatability or the personality of a villain when it's this unknowable creature. Back to kind of the first two other types we talked about here. Let's talk about the shadowy figure from behind the scenes. We kind of talked, you had this betrayal aspect with yours, which was really, really hit well. And for at least one character, I'm sure, in the party is very memorable because they're angry at their the one person they liked in the world betraying them. But he was a grouchy bastard and deserved what he got. But that kind of figure pulling the strings, I feel like that is oftentimes, in my opinion, the best and most memorable villains, but also the hardest to pull off in a way that comes across really well.
They're hard villains to run in a sort of purely technical sort of standpoint, because you want to lace the clues in there, and you want to have them sort of always acting behind the scenes and getting the player characters to trust them and freely share information and always maneuvering, and you want that reveal to really land. The problem is, player characters, by and large, tend to be relatively smart. They tend to figure stuff out along the way. It is really not uncommon for somebody to be like, oh, I wonder if this is what's going on. And the DM just looks down at their notes, and it's just they just read a line from their notes word for word. And there was a moment somewhere in the middle of that campaign where and it might have been you, was I wonder if Custavian's actually an asshole. That's really gonna suck if he is, but it's I wonder if he's actually one of the bad guys. And it's kind of this moment of ooh, I really want them to keep trusting this character and keep sharing information with him, because then there's always these interesting moments of that villainous bastard, how did he know? How did he know what we were working on? How did he know where we were? And it's well, because you were telling him.
You were sending him I was sending him a highly detailed field report of everything that we were doing.
And it's and you absolutely lose an element of that campaign if the players stop doing that.
And I mean, for me as a player in that, I was the person who brought that up at one point, and that was purely as a player being narratively that would be really good. But as a character, I was I have no real reason to believe that, and I'm an experienced enough player that I'm not going to be I'm going to stop sending him stuff just in case.
Right.
It's that's not what this character would do. This character has a way he does things, and that's what I'm going to keep doing. I had some suspicions, but again, that was entirely I'm a DM, I'm a storyteller. Narratively, this would be a very resounding thwack at the end of this story, and I just let that leave from my mind.
Yeah,
at that point
they're very difficult to run for exactly that reason, because it all needs to make sense at the end, but you don't really want players picking up on it along the way, but you need all that groundwork sort of laid in there. They're very hard to run, but you do have some leeway there because you can really control how approachable they are. Yeah. You can really control how much information the players get. And you can really help to sort of steer it in one direction or another. And a really good thing to do is offer some decoys. Mm-hmm. Have some kind of shadowy nobles who ultimately are good guys, have good intentions, but lace them in just the right way that the player characters are like, I wonder if it's this mysterious, young prince from the north that we keep hearing about. Like, I don't know.
Why has he got twin assassins working for him?
This guy's got a real sketchy, ominous sounding last name. I don't know.
Yes. The nice thing too is if you don't, having the betrayal aspect is a really cool punch. But if that part's not there, you have even more freedom in that the players, they might know the name of this entity, they just don't know where they are or who they are, and you only lace in the details that you want them to know. You can very much have like acolytes, even somewhat trusted acolytes, who don't know the true name, or even if they can magically have the truth pulled out of them with spells or whatever, like they still just, this person covers their tracks well. Even their most trusted generals could never tell you where they were at within a couple of days of the time they're found.
You're looking at your Moriartys and your even like Emperor Palpatine. You know what I mean? It's, you want this figure who's like, who is pulling the strings potentially on both sides of a war, who is sort of playing all these different sides and is supposed to be sort of matching the characters in cleverness and in like and probably well surpassing them in tactical preparation, because player characters never prepare for anything. Sometimes they don't even prepare spells in the sort of class and archetype that they decided to play.
Sometimes you as a DM build an entire puzzle entirely for the illusion wizard to get to do cool illusion wizard things, and they're like, oh, this is an illusion, hey illusion wizard. He's like, I didn't prepare any illusion spells. And you're like, kill him, god damn it. But that's another rant for another time.
If you're aiming for that reveal, this is kind of the type of villain you're probably going to want, is the sort of shadowy puppet master. Because that's sort of that, if done right, that reveal is going to be very satisfying and is going to make that character very memorable, across the board. And it's even better when it's fairly subtle. When it's just like, you go up and knock on Gustavian's door, he's not in his office, and it's just like, I'm just going to look around a little bit. And it's like, it's okay. It's like, well, you're in his office, and there's two doors. One out into the hallway you just came in through, and another one. It's like, you go through the other door, and it's like in his bedroom. It's like, what's in his bedroom? It's like, hey, a big 4-poster bed, another smaller desk, and a broken standing mirror. And it's just like, broken mirror? Wait, and it's just this, like, putting these pieces together, and it's this immediate moment of, like, we need to go now. Like, we know where this is happening. We know who's doing it. Like, hop on our giant eagles and ride.
And that we did.
And that you did. And then you immediately sort of jump into the final boss fight. It's a subtle reveal. It requires you to remember a detail from an early session. But it really pays off because it's not you. Like, you can totally get away with fully revealing it to the players. It's so much better when the players have that moment where they just fully figure it out for themselves.
Yeah. Another really good way to do this, I think, using Devils of the West as an example, because Dr. Gladstone was very much the kind of shadowy puppet master villain, but not in the sense of like he's this secretive figure with an alter ego in the real world, which sometimes you guys were trying to figure out, what if he was actually.
There wasn't a reveal that Captain Fox was Gladstone or anything like that. It was a figure we had not met up to that point.
And Dr. Gladstone, I had thought out and had motives and stuff behind like who he was and what he was doing, but that was never really what made him an interesting villain. What made him an interesting villain was the plan and piecing it together. The actual fight with him was a kind of a big final combat, but him as a character, like, it wasn't the final monologue that made him an interesting villain. I think him as a villain, if it was just the final fight and didn't have the story building up to it, he would have been a pretty generic villain.
Yes.
He had some weird mechanical stuff going on, but that's not what players remember anyways.
No, it's and some of that weird mechanical weirdness was entirely our own doing, because a good DM always stands by their threats.
Absolutely. But it was the piece by piece, and it was the fact that
it's the weirdness of his plan. You know, it's like especially in a campaign where we are constantly dealing with scientists.
Slight spoiler alerts here if you're wanting to watch through Devils of the West.
Highly recommend it.
Which you should.
It was a ton of fun. There are quite a few quotes from Devils of the West we still just use as part of our cultural lexicon.
Yes.
It's, you know, but like Gladstone's plan is just weird on a scale that we hadn't seen even with any of the mad scientists that we dealt with. And it required him to wrangle all of these other mad scientists and like put the pieces of all of their sort of work together. You know, and like when we were reaching the point where it's just like zombie cyborg werewolves, it's just like, this is truly the craziest thing in a campaign full of crazy things. And that's the villain's plan, and that's something we should probably talk about when we're done talking about the types of villains. The villain's plan and their like specific actions will go a long way towards whether or not that villain is memorable.
Absolutely. And is a good way, if you want your villain to be overall like the classic mad scientist villain, you can make them still very interesting by the weirdness and complexity of their plan. And that's almost branching into that unfathomable otherworldly being, when it's something a being like a mad scientist villain, where it's like, yes, there's some like, I can make a connection, this is another human being, we got a mad scientist in the party, I get it, but also zombie cyborg werewolves, which was kind of true.
Stop turning my brother into a werewolf and then digging him up, resurrecting him, and doing it again.
You scumbag. But yeah, it's just, and it allows for this like, it's the whole point of that kind of pulling the strings from behind is like, you always feel, or especially at higher intensity moments of the campaign, you feel like I'm just a week behind him. I'm on this trail. I found this. This is going to point me to the next thing. And sometimes there's a gap between those clues, and you're doing other side quests and stuff. But it's like, this ties back to this, and it all started back. I had this plan from the beginning, and that's something that you need to have with this kind of a villain. Of like, the first thing you do, seemingly unrelated, there's a book on the shelf that's written by this Dr. Gladstone. But then the next time something weird happens with a mad scientist, he's got the same book.
And that's the thing, is like, you know, the first copy of the book is setting the scene for the world. It's set dressing.
Yes.
It's a lore entry that you pick up in a video game. Of just like, well, this is a crazy, weird little book that's just supposed to say something about the world. The second time that we run into that book in very similar circumstances, it starts to look, Matty G is fond of saying, like, if I had a nickel for every time this had happened, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice.
Yeah.
It's exactly that moment, and finding the second book in Dr. Bjorklund's laboratory is very much this moment of like, wait a minute, why is this here? This is weird. And then Professor Contagia has one, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's a lot going on here. Like this means something. And that
and you find like a letter that she is receiving or sending to, missives to Dr. Gladstone. You start to see that, this isn't a bunch of deranged people in random corners of the world. This is a complex network of deranged people serving one master deranged person.
And then it's that book, because that book is essentially useless to us at that point. Its purpose has been met. By that point, it just becomes a trophy. Every mad scientist we dealt with after that, it's just like, do they have a signed copy of this? That's ours now.
That's ours.
And we're just like
we're
just building a box set collection of signed copies of the same book. Which once again just helps to make that villain memorable.
Missed DM note. You guys should have found the rough draft, like typewriter pages of his book in his personal needs to be the final stamp on the set.
That would have been sweet.
There you go.
We missed it.
We all make mistakes as DMs. We all miss our opportunities. That would have been really good.
And then the final villain, and a extremely common one, and again extremely varied in scale. You have your tyrants, your warlords, your
emperors,
your demon king intent on conquering the mortal plane, but in a very sort of not quite relatable, but it like fairly present, scaled down sense. A lot of use here. A lot of use in our campaigns, a lot of
yeah.
use in pre-builts.
I think that this is a pretty de facto main villain a lot of the time. In your very high scale, high level, your kind of unknowable evil tends to be that. But at your like low to mid scale, the tyrant tends to be, I think, the most common villain. And like almost everything we talk about in this, it can be a little bit like repetitive or like, oh, that's the generic villain. It's only generic if you make it generic. You can make a very full, rich, interesting villain that is the kind of classic tyrant king, tyrant emperor, conqueror, warlord, whatever sort of villain. The one that immediately comes to my mind is from the original campaign that I ran when our first group all came together, which was the Dracos campaign, which is kind of this empire run by metallic dragons who had kind of become evil. They weren't necessarily evil. It was on the moral compass, it was in the gray, the dark gray sort of area. And this kind of main villain, this kind of patriarch of the house, the emperor of this kind of conquering empire, was the big bad evil guy and was kind of the big bad evil guy from the beginning. At least his empire was. You guys were kind of always at odds with his empire just by the nature of how I started the game. And the big final fight was against him as you finished like overturning this empire with the allies you gathered throughout.
It's the assault on the capital city and sort of storming the palace itself.
The thing that makes it the tyrant villain is that he wasn't a name you had heard, but who knows where this is the leader of this empire. You don't necessarily know where his throne room is, but there's probably a big fancy building in the capital, and that's probably where he hangs out a lot of the time when he's not off conquering. But you are never really able to attack him directly until you have breached the walls of the city with your combined forces, until your select group of the hardened individuals has stormed his keep and you're finally in the throne room where you get to fight him.
Your sorcerer queens, intent on, there aren't, armies marching across the known world, collecting artifacts of power are going to fall into this category. If you're doing really grounded campaigns or sort of historically inspired campaigns. For example, I'm running an Epic 6 game right now on the channel that's very heavily inspired by the ancient Mediterranean, sort of the height of the Roman Empire. And there's a very real chance that at least one of the villains of the campaign will just be the emperor of, essentially the emperor of Rome. They're... and they're kind of a weird mix because, like, they're an easy villain to have as a very sort of present, sort of giving grand speeches or flowery monologues, presiding over the attempted execution of the player characters that they escape from in a daring fashion, or they can be extremely unknowable, sort of only approachable at the end of the campaign. You only hear their name and run into their generals the whole game. You never actually encounter them until it's time for the final boss fight. It can really kind of go either way, and you can get a lot of mileage out of either one. But they tend to need to be sort of understandable to some degrees.
More than any of the other categories. I think that while the other ones are more complicated to run, that complexity adds depth to the character that's almost a crutch in terms of understandability needing to be present. Because for the big tyrant on the hill to be an interesting villain, he can't just be a big tyrant on the hill. You need to have at least some level of understanding of his goals or what his end goal, his or its end goal is. And that has to be something that you're like, they're wrong, but I get it. And I think there was lots of conversation after the original campaign that I ran of like, if we didn't start as like essentially slaves to this empire, we probably wouldn't have hated this guy.
Well, and
he's kind of a bit of a warmonger, but he's not like this evil, ruthless, corrupt villain.
He's absolutely a warmonger. But, like, you and I in particular had the conversation of, like, it's very easy to take a step back, look at the events of this campaign from his perspective, and look at us as the bad guys.
Mostly because you're killing all of his metallic dragon children generals and like sending body parts to him
we were kind of bragging about it because we really hated him at that point. He killed our barbarian, so we destroyed his entire empire.
Which was like a fair trade for Spardauer, in all fairness.
The man was worth it.
If anything, he got the good end of the deal.
Right, I think so. But it's like player characters have this sort of very understandable and very not necessarily predictable nature or predictable reactions, because you never necessarily know what player characters are going to do, but like player characters are, as a concept, kind of an understandable entity, and I think like not necessarily that a lot of our actions in that campaign were justified, but like our decision making makes sense. But it's easy to take especially as a storyteller, to take a step back and look at that whole thing again from a different perspective and be like, man, we were some real assholes over the course
especially
of that.
like a lot of that had to do with context you gained throughout the story too, of like because of one of the other characters' background, knowing that this empire of metallic dragonborns existed because they conquered a much more evil chromatic dragon warlord of the past and then built this empire. And so its foundation was on a good outcome, but what it had turned into was becoming something that was not good anymore.
Well,
it was warmongering, and it was
our characters
corrupt.
Sort of specifically see a very bad side of it over the course of the early part of the campaign. Not just sort of as like slave gladiators, but also then going to this besieged city and sort of all of our interactions with other NPCs is just, it's like we really see the Empire at its worst kind of consistently. And if you're going to, rely on this kind of villain, your player characters should, to some degrees, fairly early on, see that empire, that kingdom, that warlord's armies sort of at their worst.
Absolutely.
Because that's what's going to sort of define that line and make it clear sort of where this villain stands and where the player characters stand.
I think that works really well, especially if the main villain, whether directly or indirectly, kind of kicks the players in the teeth early on.
Yes.
Either them or like the entity, the organization they represent, kind of like while they're at their early, lowest, weakest, they get pushed down by this thing that they're like, man, when I'm higher level, you're going to face my wrath. And it's kind of a very subtle thing at that point. But then over the full story of learning this context of the world and it interacting and seeing often at its worst, this entity, that makes that, all right, we're going to face this guy off in the end, makes it gratifying.
Yes.
For the players.
And that's, and I think from there we can kind of, to some degrees, transition into just like some kind of villain conceptual stuff as a whole, to talking about that sort of gratifying element of it, as well as like sort of specific villainous actions and like plans and stuff that should sort of be present for good villains. And one thing that's important to remember with villains is it's entirely possible to not have effective or serious villains and still have them be extremely memorable. Look at Handsome Jack in Borderlands 2. He's always calling you on the radio to talk shit every 5 minutes. And he's one of the funniest characters in the game. During one of the most tragic moments of the game, where you had to like kill the pet of one of the characters from the first game, it is this like big impactful moment, and he just ruins it immediately by calling on the radio because he was going to sadly play a violin sarcastically, but he can't find a violin. So it's just him yelling for somebody else to go find him a violin. And then, another 10 or 15 minutes after that, he calls back again and badly plays a violin. But the moment's passed and like, so that joke gets to land a couple of different times. You can absolutely have villains that are not serious, that are not even effective, and still have extremely memorable villains. I just think it's a thing worth mentioning.
That's a good thing out there. And that kind of, we talked a little before this recording of like comic book evil villains, or like the kind of Dick Dastardly evil.
Yes.
So tying the lady to the train tracks. That works as a villain if you lean into it. You have to really make it like, this guy is the comic book evil guy. You can do that, but you have to really lean in and bring in a lot of those tropes and that. And it's more, the memorability of it is more on that kind of tropey, over the top, villainous villain than it is on that villain like, oh wow, what a complex and interesting character.
And there's a very good chance that if you do that character right, if you make that character fun enough, the player characters will refuse to kill that villain. So then they get to sort of continue to defeat that villain's plans over the course of the campaign, as they're sort of constantly showing up, and the player characters either just cut him loose or throw him in prison or just sort of beat him up and take his lunch money. every time. But that lets you sort of get around the thing of like the player character sort of fighting a main villain too early. And that doesn't necessarily always work for main villains. It tends to work better for sort of side villains. And it's going to be even better when that villain interrupts a much more serious, villainous encounter. When you're dealing with sort of a true villain, but Dick Dastardly shows up.
Wanting his revenge.
It puts everybody in peril.
Probably with a gunpowder-related shenanigan.
It's like the comic book evil thing can absolutely work, but you really do, I think, need to lean into it and like know what it is you're doing and really go for it.
Transitioning from that, let's talk, like you were saying, the kind of specific actions. Some examples of really good specific actions villains can take to help make them more interesting, more complex, and make them land well. What are some ideas you have there?
Well, I mean, part of it's, how villainous you want your villain to be. Mm-hmm. There are certain things that we, just part of our sort of social contract and just sort of our play group, there are certain things that we just completely stray away from. Because it's just like, nope, we're not dealing with that.
We play
shit.
These games for fun.
Yes, we're not dealing with that sitting here at our table. And I think that is an excellent thing to do, and you should make that sort of part of your social contract. It'll just help everybody enjoy the game more. Mm-hmm. But like you mentioned earlier, the villain sort of kicking the players in the teeth early on, and it is absolutely fine to have villains, truly threatening players or threatening things players care about, or actually destroying them early on. If that's sort of the punch you are aiming for, the village that the player characters have been, sort of halfway staying in, while they've
made friends with the local NPCs.
They've been hitting the dungeons in the local area and, doing side quests and stuff. And then, and that village being destroyed is going to really drive the players against that main villain and help to get the players involved in that main story. And it helps to set the standard that this is the villain and this is the things, these are the things they're willing to do. Mm-hmm. And that moment at some point in the campaign of showcasing what the villain is capable and willing to do tends to really add a lot to the story overall.
Definitely. I think that's a good way to set up a villain early on and show, and when you say what they're able to do, it's kind of twofold. Like sometimes it can mechanically be like, yes, oh, this is a very powerful entity who is able to do these.
Oh, it turns out this guy can cast power word kill.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shoot. We're third level. We should probably back off.
Let's level up to where all have at least 100 hit points, and then we can go fight the boss.
Yeah, like you see, it can be that, or what they're capable of versus what they are willing to do.
Yes.
And kind of
how even just what they're capable of in terms of the resources they have at their command, and stuff like that. The even if you want to showcase certain magic items or show off minor villains and lieutenants in that same capacity. And what they're willing to do. Mm-hmm. That really goes a long way towards establishing a villain.
I think another thing that we've touched on before, too, is having the sort of cult around the villain, mm-hmm. whether that's a literal cult or not, to be a reflection of that villain's goals and beliefs.
Yes.
Seeing if you encounter the evil Baron's men out in the field, they should be a lot more like they're looting and burning things after they finish conquering the place because they're evil. They're not just there to defeat the army; they're attacking the village afterwards.
As funny as it is to have the Baron's men be extremely apologetic about arresting the player characters for breaking whatever tyrannical law the Baron has established, it doesn't work all that well to establish the Baron as
disarming.
A hateable villain.
It's disarming towards the villain. It makes him seem a little goofier that his men
don't
have that respect
and if that's what you're going for, that's that's a disconnect that works very well in your favor. If you're it's once again like if you're either going for the comic book evil thing or if you're just trying to establish a goofier villain, having his men be extreme, like they're still doing what he's ordered them, but they're just really apologetic about it. Really does help to, as you said, disarm that whole situation, mm-hmm. And is going to help to showcase the type of villain that your players are dealing with. And that's really kind of the important thing is like, you really should, if possible, represent your villains accurately. obviously sometimes there's going to be some deception, some stuff going on behind the scenes, but if you want a serious villain, if you want a villain to be feared, the actions, of that villain's factions or the actions that villain take should reinforce that.
Yes. And if they don't, it should be intentional.
Yes.
It should be either you've intentionally set up a situation that slightly throws it off to mislead characters for a reason, or it is that villain being showing just how intelligent and conniving this villain is. They've intentionally set this up to mislead the players. Mm-hmm. Things along those lines. Otherwise, you should always try to accurately represent, with whether it's their direct actions or the actions of their cult in the world, it should accurately represent the villain.
Yes.
So that the players are the kind of villain that the players are building up in their mind when they confront them, that's the villain that they're facing, at least somewhat. I think another interesting thing to do, and something that's missed oftentimes, is if your big villain is like your big villain of the story, and this is a long-running story, have the player characters kind of see the villain and their ilk's actions when it doesn't pertain to the group. If this is a big overarching threat, like this is the emperor of this world, it shouldn't just be like assassins that the emperor sent after them. Right. If they're a group of second level characters who just burnt down one of his towers in a distant land, he doesn't care that much. Like this villain might not be sending the royal assassins after you yet. But seeing a village that's been attacked by his men, unrelated to you, shows what that villain's kind of MO is without it being direct to the players. Or just like happening upon an area where this evil Lich Lord is worshipped, where the cult exists, and you kind of having it really grounds the villain and makes the world feel like something we talk about a lot. The world's moving when the players aren't there. They see like, oh, this is the villain interacting with the world, and it doesn't pertain to us. We just happened upon it. And I think that's a really good tool you can use to showcase the villain's goals / just like mindset and MO.
Well, and once again, that's another one of those opportunities to also showcase what a villain is capable of or what a villain is willing to do. Mm-hmm. Coming across a cursed swamp and flooded village, and the one old man who still lives there is just like, oh yeah, this was a great farming town until about a year ago. Mm-hmm. And it's like, this is the Lich King's magic that's doing all this. We were short on our taxes one month, so he did this. It's just that it lets the player characters know what they're dealing with. It lets them know what to expect when they eventually sort of encounter that villain. And it's, and it's ways to do stuff. You can do stuff really thematic as well. You can, really, whether it's sort of, a sort of fire-based villain or an ice-based villain is going to change the encounters that the player characters run into. Whether it's this very sort of, law and order tyrant, or this, just sort of, evil, chaotic, force that exists in the world. That's going to completely change the style of encounters that the players will run into. It's going to completely change how the villain sort of showcases themselves. And all of that lets the players know, at least to some degrees, kind of what to expect when they eventually run into them.
Like we were saying before, it's important to build up that both mechanically, personality, thematically, build up what this villain is before they interact with it, and then have that hit in a way that, all those pieces come together and it makes sense. Whether they have the full picture or not, the villain that you've built up in their head is pretty dang close to the villain that they run into, with maybe some interesting twist or turn added to it. What are some other things you can think of as far as any other actions that you could see villains taking that help build them up well?
I mean, the villain's plan is should be fairly integral to your sort of planning the villain. Mm-hmm. And again, that's kind of hard to do with big sort of eldritch entities or unknowable evils. But especially if you're working with a villain that's kind of a tyrant or sort of puppet master, or that shadowy reflection of other players, it's a really good idea to figure out a lot of their plan fairly early on, because that's really going to affect the actions that the villain takes and the way they interact with the players over the course of the campaign. If the players end up with one of the artifacts that the main villain is seeking, and they likely will, that's going to change, because at that point maybe he is sending the royal assassins after them, because now they have something that's important enough to him to warrant that. And if the villain is just sort of building this massive ritual circle that's covering an entire continent, the pieces of that should be visible to some degrees to the players, and is going to change how sort of that cult acts and like the actions the villain takes sort of in response to things around that. Like really like knowing the plan of the villain, sort of if there is a main goal or scheme, should be done fairly early. You're going to get a lot more mileage out of it that way. It's really just important with villains to, as we were saying, showcase the type of villain they are and showcase what players can expect from them. And their plans are sort of a piece of that, some of those moments are showcasing what the villain is sort of working towards, or at least giving little hints, that the players can then collect and draw their own conclusions from.
Likely wrong conclusions.
Almost certainly.
Almost certainly wrong conclusions from. Or near right, but weird and off in some way. I think something else I'd like to discuss quickly, too, is something that is the least important piece of the pie, but is still a piece of it. It's the cherry on top, and that is kind of the mechanical decisions you make for a villain. A big evil villain, and specifically boss fights. And this could probably be a whole other talk we could do later, going into kind of the real nitty-gritty of. The way I would word it is, you want your villain to be memorable, so that 2 years from now, when you're reminiscing about the campaign, players are still thinking about that villain. You want your boss fight to be memorable in the way that night everyone is really satisfied with that session, and it feels like a worthy capstone experience on the story. It's very likely that a year down the line, the specifics of those mechanics are not going to be remembered. Right. And the effort you put into that is still valuable, though. And I think that as hard as it is to balance encounters, especially in systems like 5e D&D, taking the time to really well balance and really spend time making a very interesting and full encounter that feels like there's lots of moving pieces and stuff, so it's this grand thing, really just... Typically, this is going to be the last or one of the last sessions of the game, and you want it to be that end experience that you've put that effort into, and it's worth putting that effort into it.
Yeah, and quite often these are going to be fights where you're taking the rulebook and throwing it out the window. As far as, the raw mechanical rules of, for example, Power Word Kill, 9th level spell slots. It's a much more interesting boss fight if the boss has 4 or 6 9th level spell slots, and if the players are at a high enough level
to contest with
that.
Yeah.
That, because at that point there is, apocalyptic scale magic being thrown around by both sides, and that just is that sort of grandness of scale is automatically a little more interesting. But by the rules, that's not really something you can do. There are kind of ways to cheat it. Snowmen, mostly.
Yeah, snowmen are kind of bogus, but that's a whole other
no, bogus couldn't do any magic at all. He was a mad scientist. But that's one of those things that's like, in a strictly mechanical sense, you're sort of breaking the game, and that's fine. Don't hold yourself quite as strictly to those mechanical standards, as long as you're still making an effort to make the fight close, but very slightly in the player's favor.
Yes. And I highly recommend another content shameless plug here, our transitional combats video, and really leaning into something like that for your boss fight, of having complex combats. Not just the villain itself is mechanically interesting, having ads that are interesting, having a setting that is interesting, having it potentially happen in multiple phases where the floor falls out from underneath
multiple
you and now
phases
you're in
or
a different
multiple
place.
arenas.
Yes.
And that's
you have to chase this villain through the plains.
One of the other big piece of advice that I would give is your boss fight shouldn't be in a giant blank room. There should be something going on. The arena itself should be somewhat interesting in some way. Even if the entire boss fight is taking place as all of the characters and the villain are in free fall from the heavens. Like, it's like that's going to change how stuff sort of lands and the
no pun intended.
We'll see who lands.
We'll see who's alive when they land and who's alive after they land.
But that's going to change the way what spells are viable. That's going to change what abilities can actually be used, and it's just going to make especially if the setup to that fight is as cool as the fight itself. Like the completely sensible lore reason as to why you're all falling from the heavens during your final boss fight. Like, that's going to be really cool. I'm a huge fan of what I refer to as set piece battles. Like the big combats that aren't they're not happening every session. They're prepared well in advance. Quite often they're transitional combats in the sense that, like, you might be moving from arena to arena, or there is some other consideration going on sort of as far as the battlefield is concerned. Like, I'm a big fan of those in general, and those tend to make fights more memorable, and it tends to really contribute a lot to boss fights.
And you can even, again, don't need to go into the full details of that other video about making more interesting combats. Check it out. But you can have, like, multi-phase arenas as well as multi-phase villains. Like, this isn't even my final form. I steal a note from steal a note from, like, a lot of Souls-esque video games where it's like, I blasted this chunk off of this villain and now they're more dangerous in a different way? What is happening here? Where, all of a sudden
this boss has a second phase. Okay.
It's like, we're fighting Metal Gear. Oh no! Dr. Jekyll fell out of Metal Gear.
And turned into Mr. Hyde.
Oh no!
Right,
and that sort of situation, that having it be big and you really want it to land. And like I said, that's not the most important piece. That's not the piece that's going to stick with the players, likely. It's going to be a lot more the actions throughout and the villain as an entity themselves. But that night, it's going to be the thing that makes all the build-up, all the effort you put into making this interesting villain land and have an absolution that feels really good.
Well, and go all out in terms of sort of trying to put that cinematic spin on it. If you don't normally play background music during your campaigns, find a piece of background music that really, really works. Just play the Black Sails theme on a loop during the big pirate fleet battle at the end of your pirate campaign. Like if have visuals of some kind, like really, like, it's weird that one of the best things you can do to really make your villains great is, like, doing thematic stuff at the table where you're sitting in real life. Like, that adds a lot to that final fight and adds a lot to the villain that is a part of that fight. You're really going to get a lot more mileage out of it than you think.
I think that most advice given out about main villains is about making them interesting and making them not one-dimensional, and that's the most important piece. But I do feel that because of it, the mechanical side and the actual real rules interaction with them gets overlooked or gets downplayed. And I think that, I guess, that's the capstone. That's the end piece that finalizes. And you don't want to go through all this effort and all this thought and make this super cool villain and then put your players in a 55 by 50 foot square cube and have them stand in a circle with this villain and bop each other until one person falls over.
And that's, and some systems do that better than others. D&D is a system that really has an issue with its combats feeling like two people standing there bopping each other with sticks until one falls down. But D&D isn't always that way.
And you can fudge the rules to fix it.
And how you build your combats are really going to affect how that actually plays out.
Make there be stakes as well. Because steaks are delicious. Also, make there be stakes because like a time crunch or the villain's plan coming to fruition. You have to stop the ritual. You have to close the portal. You have to enter your crisis threat here. That being a play, then there's other interactions and stuff going on in the world. It's like the wizard really needs to be able to dispel the ward that the defensive ward this thing just put on itself. But he's also the one who's over here making an Arcana check to dismantle the portal that his villainous army is funneling out through. Like that decision making and that complexity will make for a really cool session. I think we're pretty close timing wise. There's a lot more we can say about main villains. Is there any other things you'd want to kind of toss out there before we close it up?
Not necessarily. Nothing's like necessarily coming to mind apart from what you mentioned briefly of like villains should be complex. They should be unique. They should be interesting. If every one of your campaigns just has variants of the same villain, you're going to get less and less mileage out of it every time. And villains that are understandable, villains that have some complexity to them, villains that aren't just only evil tend to be more interesting. And if they're going to be only evil, it's better to make them sort of alien, sort of unknown. It really is better to make to essentially build your villains in the same way you build either any of your other NPCs or any player character that you would have. That will just ultimately make them both more satisfying to interact with and more satisfying to eventually defeat.
Eventually vanquish, yes. And, yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to call it. Like I said, we could go on for a long time. Villains are complex. One last note going off of what you were saying there. Villains being unique and interesting doesn't mean they have to be weird.
Yes.
You can still take, and we've talked about tropes and stuff in the past, like you can take a very tropey, archetypical villain and make them the most interesting and memorable villain that your players have ever faced. It's all about the story you're telling with them, and it is all about the effort you put into making them interesting and making the world show how interesting and complex they are.
You use tropes in your campaign.
Use tropes.
They exist.
Just use them well.
They are popular for a reason. You will really get a lot of mileage out of rescuing princesses from towers. You could build an entire campaign out of rescuing princesses from towers.
You could have adventuring company that all they do is rescue
princesses from towers. That or like maidens from towers and stuff. Like that could be a really fun campaign to like really lean into some of that like the kind of goofy trope stuff. Just over the course of the whole campaign. And have just a really, really tropey comic book Dick Dastardly villain.
Call to action. If you watch this and you get to this point of the video, I would absolutely love to have a comment about what you think the name of an adventuring group that exclusively saves maidens from towers would be called.
Oh.
I can't wait to hear it. If there's any, I'll be happy. I just love that. I'm already thinking of lots of puns, most of them inappropriate.
I can't come up with any puns, so whether we stop recording, I'm excited to hear it.
But I think that's where we'll call it. I think this is what where we'll let y'all go. Thanks for listening /washing. Thanks for washing. Wash up. Thanks for listening /watching to Bonus Action. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you've learned something or at least found something that you can use in your game. And we will see you in the next one. Your turn. You do the intro this time.
I don't have an intro.
It's the same every time, except every now and then we say something weird and dumb to go along with it.
You say something weird and dumb.
How dare you?
Partially just because you do most of the intro. So by process of elimination.
Hey, a majority of weird and dumb things said on this channel have been by me, probably.
Well, I don't know.
Well... Does role play count?
Exactly.
Grimes is up there.
Well, that's Are you including like if you're?
I'm not dumb. I'm role playing.
I just role play a lot of really dumb characters.
I need to stop role-playing intelligent characters. It's a lot more stressful. It's a lot easier to just be the big, broody idiot.
Yeah, but every time you are the big, broody idiot, you're just like, if I was a lawful neutral detective, I could solve this problem.
Blow this thing wide open.
Half the time. Why am I playing a good guy?
Playing good characters is so limiting in problem-solving potential. Not to be evil, but lawful neutral? Ooh.
Not even chaotic neutral, but...
But then you're just being good old chaotic neutral.
Yeah.
Getting judged.
There's nothing wrong with being chaotic neutral. It's really just, it's one of those things where it comes down a lot more to the character than it does to the alignment, which is part of the reason that half the time I don't even write an alignment on my character sheet. Same thing with like the class isn't what makes a character interesting. It's the character themselves
and the decisions you make with them.
Yeah, I wanna play a, like, maybe it'd be a fighter ranger multi-class. It might just be champion fighter, but I want to do like a Robin Hood build with the like sharpshooter, like kind of a crit fisher thing with champion fighter and the like piercer feat. So it's just like, if I crit, you hit
the arrow with the air.
That
was probably not the best motion for hit the arrow with the arrow. Why didn't I do this? Oh no! Can't win for losing.